Hello all. So today we're doing Plato's Theaetetus. We're only reading the second half and hopefully this isn't too burdensome. I realize it's a relatively long reading, but we only have 4 readings this week, and considering this is a summer course, I think most of the readings have been rather short. So this is one of the longer ones, but it's worthwhile because it's a foundational text on epistemology, which is pretty much what this course is all about, and it'll get you familiar with Plato, who's one of the most famous figures in philosophy. So when anyone ever asks you or references Plato, you at least have some basis of understanding by which to make sense of the conversation. So, epistemology. Last lecture was on Of Miracles by Hume, and that was sort of a case of applied epistemology. So he has certain sort of um, axioms or results that he's drawn based on uh, his sort of presuppositions about the origins of ideas. And then he applies his system to the case of miracles and finds we don't have good reason to believe in miracles. So that's kind of an applied case of epistemology, a specific issue, whether or not we should believe in a specific sort of thing. The Theaetetus, on the other hand, is much more foundational. So this is thought to be the first text on epistemology proper, on knowledge and knowing and what those terms mean. And as such, it deals with the problem in a much more basic way. It tries to define concepts like knowledge and explanation and these sorts of things. So we'll get a taste for the Socratic method here and just do a rundown, and I'll provide some additional commentary, food for thought, in case you want to write on this topic. So foremost, we'll talk about Plato for a minute. So Plato, I could do a long history of this guy on his own, but I guess most notably I wrote down these key points. And so he was an ancient Greek. He lived during the golden age of Greece. He lived through, if any of you are familiar, the Peloponnesian War. He lived to a pretty ripe old age, as you can see, and so his life experiences shaped a lot of his thoughts, you might think. So one of the things that was most influential in his life was the fact that he was a student of Socrates. So sometimes people have trouble disambiguating between the various historical Greek figures of this time. So one way to think of it is spa. So Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. That's the historical order of the three dudes. Um, and so Socrates was around. Socrates never wrote anything down himself, and just sort of hung out on the streets of Athens, bothered people, asked them questions, made them try to explain themselves and why they believed various things. And a bunch of young people thought this was a pretty nifty thing to do. And among those people was Plato. So Plato spent his life studying under Socrates. He ultimately watched Socrates die by drinking hemlock because Socrates was ordered to kill himself by the state for being a nuisance and for corrupting the youth and for disbelieving in the gods of the state. So this sort of the figure of Socrates plays prominently in the dialogues because, well, they're just that, they're dialogues. So Plato, rather than writing just straight treatises like most other philosophers, Plato went out of his way to create dialogues. So they're like the conversations that Socrates had, um, but there's some debate as to how historical they are. There's traditionally a divide between the various uh, dialogues. So there's early, middle, and late dialogues, and we don't need to go into that too much. But point being, it's thought that not all of these dialogues are transcribing things that Socrates actually said. Many of them are in fact just using Socrates as a mouthpiece. Plato is propounding his own ideas, and he just is using the character of Socrates to his own purposes. Um, Another famous thing that you might have heard is that all of that Alfred Whitehead has this quote, and it goes roughly the safest characterization of Western philosophy is that it is all a series of footnotes to Plato. So that quote is significant insofar as I think some people say it's wrong, but in a certain sense there's something to it. Maybe not insofar as people were conscientiously um, writing in the stead of Plato, but insofar as Plato touched on most everything that is of concern in the modern world today. So epistemology is still a live field, metaphysics. Um, there's just a ton of things, and sometimes it's in brief passing, but Plato hits on such an immense array of things that so he's an interesting source to read for that reason as well. Um, Thousands of years before schools of thought arose, Plato had identified them as sort of viable modes of thought and even provided objections to them in many cases, and so hopefully we'll see that today as well. So, as I mentioned, the sort of spa thing, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, he was a teacher of Aristotle, and Aristotle went on to do a whole bunch of writing of his own right in sort of a different vein. And then, of course, um, Aristotle was a tutor to Alexander the Great, so I guess that was kind of the end of the great lineage. Uh, and I already know the dialogues, which is kind of an interesting historical issue of itself. And then, last but not least, Plato's probably most well known for propounding the theory of the forms, and that's kind of an idea beyond the scope of this. But if you ever hear the forms, so I guess the basic idea here is that there are things. So this might sound vaguely familiar. Um, there are entities which are timeless, unchanging, immutable, perfect embodiments of all of the objects that exist in the world. So it's sort of an explanation for why specific objects in the world exist as they do. So why is there a chair? Well, a chair in this world is just sort of a rough instantiation of the form of a chair. And so this famous picture, you've probably seen it, Plato's pointing up because presumably he's referencing the forms, and sometimes people jokingly call this Plato's heaven because it's kind of a perfect world of entities. So there's some background, but now we'll get into the actual content. So we start halfway through, and I started a little bit earlier than the actual talk on epistemology, in part because Plato has some interesting remarks through Socrates on philosophy. So I think one of the interesting things that we've seen throughout this course is various takes on what philosophers should do, or what the role of philosophy is, or if it's how worthwhile it is. And that hasn't been a main theme, but it's been in passing. Hume has talked about this sort of thing. And Plato is probably one of the most avid advocates of philosophy there is. He doesn't have any doubts as to whether he's doing the right thing and whether philosophy is a worthwhile profession. So he has these sort of remarks about talking with regard to a king, and he just sort of mocks the king as a sort of fancy goat herder, for example, or cow herder. And all the king spends his time doing is thinking about how much he can squeeze out of his cows or how much revenue he can get out of his subjects. And you might say the same thing about a modern businessman. It's just sort of a game in which you just try to take as much from people as possible in the long run. And then the great walls of his citadel are really just sort of a pen to keep in the animals. And likewise, he has this remark on sort of generational pride. So I guess in ancient Athens it was a point of pride, and today it still is. People talk about how, I come from the founding fathers or something like that. To say, my lineage is 25 generations long, I can identify my great great to the 25th degree grandfather, and show that he was an Athenian too. And this is supposed to be a point of pride, but Plato sort of says, in the scheme of the universe, of infinity, of the origin of all things, how could it be of any interest what happened 25 generations ago and not 26? And if you think about that 25th ancestors, 25th ancestor, so 50 generations back for you, you know, what are the odds that you came from a pauper or a barbarian or some other sort of foreigner? So for the Greeks, just a note, barbarian means basically anyone that's not Greek. And apparently the story goes that barbarian just means it refers to the way that Greeks interpreted foreign speech. So it sounded to the Greeks as if all foreigners were saying something roughly like bar 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 bar. So barbarian. Um, yeah, so those are just interesting points to think about. Um, whether or not you take them seriously is interesting, and yeah. So now we're getting into the more genuinely philosophical, and the first point, well, I shouldn't say genuinely philosophical, I should say a matter of epistemology. Um, and this, and we first encounter this sort of epistemological issue in the context of Protagoras. So Protagoras was a famous ancient Greek, real person, and his most famous quote is, "Man is the measure of all things." So the idea here is that it depends on how extreme you want to take this, but roughly there are no objective facts of the matter. And when we say objective, we mean independent of the mind in this context. So nothing is the case except for insofar as there is a man that can project upon it and give it some sort of factual standing or some yeah. So there are no facts apart from perceivers. This might be another way of thinking about it. So this sort of entails the premise that perception is reality. So whatever I see just is the case about the world. So you might want to clarify this idea in two different ways. So there's this sort of Cartesian thought that we talked about, that your mental representation just is the case, right? So in a certain sense, your perception is reality because whatever you perceive really is happening. Even if it's totally mistaken, even if there's an evil demon, it still is the case that you are having experiences. Um, but on the other hand, it's a further step to say that those experiences reflect something in the world or dictate how the world is arranged. And so um, Socrates, or Plato through Socrates, I'll just say Socrates to simplify, is attacking the latter view, that insofar as we perceive, that's dictating the way things are in the actual world. So that there's this correspondence between our perception and the world. So Socrates provides a number of objections to this view because if it's taken to its extreme, it's clearly far too strong. And one of the clearest examples of this is the case of a fever. So I'm going to write down these notes. So there's the Cartesian sense we noted, and then the correspondence sense. So the objections to these come in the form of examples, and this is a very common tactic of Socrates. He said, he'll just say, but wouldn't you think that the best trainer should be the one who says what's right and not just any old person off the street? And that trope occurs hundreds of times throughout the dialogues, maybe thousands. So in the case of a fever, a patient says he is hot, and a doctor says the patient is cold, and it just seems like they can't both be right. Right? Our traditional view of things is that there's a fact of the matter that's independent of what either one thinks about it, and you might think that's a little bit question begging because it's already presupposing exactly what Protagoras is objecting to. Um, but we won't delve in that too much. If you want to write about that, that sounds interesting. So the basic idea then is that if perception is knowledge, which is P equals K, right, um, entails that both are right. So on the one hand, the patient is perceiving that as hot. So if his perception is reality, then it is the case that since he is perceiving it as hot, then he is in fact hot. And on the other hand, the doctor is perceiving that he is cold, so he's in fact cold. So this sort of generates just a manifest contradiction. One is the patient says, my body at this exact time is hot, and the doctor says, your body at this exact time is not hot. Um, so any theory which generates a contradiction so readily is thought to be problematic or false or worth rejecting. It's not rational to hold views that produce manifest contradictions. So we don't take this view seriously. So this is the rejection, the rebuttal to the Protagoras sort of take on things. And this may recur later. Um, but the next view that Socrates attacks is the view that all is flux or everything is in motion. Uh, and this is most famously propounded by Heraclitus. So Heraclitus said, you cannot step into the same river twice. And the idea here is that, so take any given object, that object is a single unitary thing and it has an identity, and what gives it that identity is that it has a set of properties. And so this giant set of properties, all of the things that make it up, are what define that thing. So if any of those things change in any given time, it's not exactly the same thing. So it's not the same thing. And so it seems to be the case that with everything, that it's perpetually changing some of its properties, even if they're very minute. And so nothing retains its identity for any extended period. And this is most obviously the case with river, because if you take a sort of a snapshot of what it is, of what a river is at any given moment, it's composed of innumerable water molecules and rocks and whatever else you think constitutes a river, maybe ecosystems or parts of rivers. And then you allow 5 seconds to elapse, and you take another snapshot of this same river, and probably millions of organisms have died and changed and been born, and silt has been moved to new locations, and some of it has completely left the river. So, strictly speaking, this doesn't seem to be the exact same thing. And of course, the more we know about kind of modern physics, it seems like Heraclitus was onto something. Um, and that's one of the reasons why these pre-Socratics are so interesting, because they have residual significance. You still hear sort of echoes of Protagoras being stated, and Heraclitus kind of anticipated some thoughts we have today. But so every moment of you and I, we're flecking off pieces of skin. There's random electrons moving around, or just we're releasing sort of exhaust, carbon, um, and all these sorts of things suggest that we're not the exact same thing. So that's the basic idea that we. So the problem here, if we want to put this in epistemic terms, is that so you can't know anything as it is always changing. So if you're going to say that is a cat, what is a cat if a cat is something that's just constantly changing its properties? Um, and so Socrates attacks this by first and foremost making a savvy distinction, and this is always a strong philosophical move. If you think something funny is going on, you point to some difference and identify a distinction that needs to be made that could clarify the matter. So in fact, um, Socrates suggests that Heraclitus is using motion in a sort of fuzzy way, or change in a fuzzy way. On the one hand, he means like change, so everything is in motion doesn't mean literally like physically moving, but that things are changing, properties are being switched out, and then in the other half, and then in the other case, they're moving in location. So moving in place makes it sound like they're stationary. Moving in location. Um, so, and then a further result of this distinction is that all things must be doing both changing and moving in location, because if they weren't doing both, then they would both be in motion and not in motion. And that is just a result of the fact that change and moving in location are two different kinds of motion. So if it didn't change, in that sense, it wouldn't be in motion. And if it's moving in location, in that sense, it would be in motion. So if something can do both these things at the same time, that seems to be a contradiction. It's moving and it's not moving. Um, so that just doesn't seem to make sense. So everything needs to be doing both at the same time. Um, but if everything is doing changing and moving at the same time, then we can't use names to identify things because nothing stays constant. So we refer to colors or something like that, or to chairs, right? I can pick out. I use the color white, um, but you can pick a chair and refer to it. But if at every single moment that chair is changing its location, which it is well, it is, and right, the Earth is moving at least, um, and all of the electrons and stuff are moving around a little bit. The little edges of it are moving slightly. Um, if it's changing its properties and its location, then we're not referring to the same thing each time we use the name. So it seems like a problem of how do our words refer to things in the world if those things in the world don't hold constant. So it seems like we use words to sort of rigidly designate specific objects, but if the properties of those objects can change, how are we able to pick them out? So it's so this is sometimes what is called, you don't need to know this, but it might just be useful, a reductio ad absurdum. So what? So basically, trying to help me out here. Basically, the idea here is that you accept the premise that the opposition holds. You say, yeah, sure, we'll assume that everything is in fact in flux. But if we assume this sort of premise, it has an absurd result. Namely, the absurd result is that we wouldn't be able to name anything because we wouldn't be able to designate one object as distinct from another because their properties are always changing and in flux. But clearly, we can name things, so this theory seems to be false. Um, and so I think maybe Socrates is being a little slippery here. You might think that we don't need to have a sort of list of all of the necessary and sufficient conditions that make up an object in order to be able to name it. We can just have some very rough idea, and that's sufficient. So as long as those key few properties don't change, we'll be fine. It's not like we need to name all of the trillions of electrons in any given object in order to be able to have a to be able to name it. We only need to know that it maintains roughly a certain shape, and that's sufficient, or something like that. So, but anyways, you can see the structure of this argument and think about that. So now we get into this other figure, Theaetetus, and you missed his introduction from the first half of the dialogue, so I'll catch you up. Theaetetus is just a young man who is a clever boy, and apparently he's not terribly handsome. He's snub-nosed and he's short or something like that. And interestingly, that's also the way Socrates looks. Socrates is sort of known for being a kind of the first ugly Greek. That's not true, but for being a significant historical figure that wasn't just directly associated with his physical characteristics, but more of the mental life. And this is kind of a significant transition, you might think, culturally in terms of what we value. But so there's this parallel that's supposed to be suggestive, this kind of literary feature of the text, that Theaetetus is kind of similar to Socrates, and then so Theaetetus comes back and tries to make sense of knowledge with Socrates, and they're kind of in a joint effort. Interestingly, Socrates has one of his more provocative metaphors at this point, um, and he says, "I must try by my art of midwifery to deliver Theaetetus of his conceptions about knowledge." So the idea here is that Socrates himself is barren of any knowledge. He doesn't have his own ideas. He, in his Socratic fashion, always claims ignorance and says, "Oh, I don't know. I only ask questions," sort of thing. So he puts the burden on Theaetetus and just says, "Well, you have the knowledge in you. My job is just to bring it out, just to coach you along and help you in the steps so that you can birth this new knowledge." So that's the kind of strange metaphor. So the first one that they consider, view about knowledge that they consider, is that knowledge is perception. And so this is strikingly similar to what Protagoras says. Yeah, but they provide some sort of different arguments, and I found these arguments really interesting, especially in the context of what we've already read this semester. So knowledge is perception. Would take that as a premise and sort of analyze what are the results. So consider any sense that we have, any sense perception maybe, uh, uh, and then consider something like being or non-being or identity through time. The only thing that accounts for this identity through time, this being or non-being, is a medium of interpretation, namely the mind. So if we just used our sense perception to try to track a fleeting, say hypothetically, a wax candle or something like that, and all of its sensible properties change, but it still seems like we're able to track this thing and say, look, that's still the same wax, although all of its sensible properties have changed. And what explains this? The mind. So it doesn't seem like perception alone is doing all that work. It seems like in addition to perception, we also need some sort of cognitive faculty in order to make sense of things. So this knowledge is perception account is inadequate. And so what's really interesting about this is that this argument is so similar to the wax argument. And I hadn't read the Theaetetus in such close proximity to the Meditations before, so I never caught on to this. But that's just crazy to me. So this is one of the cases why Plato is always worth rereading, I guess, if you're interested in this sort of thing, and just in general as sort of a historical grounding for so many of the ideas that are commonplace in the Western canon, because Plato said it first, right? So I don't know if Descartes almost certainly read Plato, so maybe he unconsciously did this, but yeah, it pretty much has the same flavor, very similar sort of argument. So we move on because we have two reasons to. I'll go back real quick. So we have two reasons to sort of worry about knowledge's perception. Um, the first one is sort of Protagoras' worry that there can be conflicting perceptions, but only one of them can be true. And if knowledge is perception, both of them would have to be true, and that would lead to contradictions. So that's problem one. Problem two is that it seems like in understanding things like being, like a thing's existence, or identity, that the thing is the same thing through time, we're not just using sense perception, we're also using a medium of interpretation, namely the mind. And that fact is significant insofar as it shows that knowledge is perception is false. So they move on to consider another alternative, and this one's a little bit more developed account. Knowledge is true perception. So the first thing that they do is that they sort of do kind of what you might call a conceptual analysis of the very idea of the claim that knowledge is true opinion, and they say, well, I mean, if there's true opinion, there must be false opinion. And so maybe this is sort of a false distinction because it might be the case that false opinion isn't even possible. Um, and so they're sometimes called the puzzles. There's some puzzles in the Theaetetus that will be referred to. And these are probably just being slippery. So we won't dedicate too much time, but it's kind of interesting to identify the sort of quick work that uh, Socrates is doing here. So he asks, but are false beliefs possible? And he equivocates a false belief with judging what is not, and then he then moves to say that judging what is not is similar to not judging, or is the same as not judging. So it seems like a false belief is just not judging, and if it's not judging, then it's not a belief at all because we're not, asserting anything about the world. It's not a statement, a true or false claim about the way the world is. We don't have any sort of take on what the world is like. So to me, this is a clear case of equivocation. This is just being really slippery. But one of the interesting things about the dialogues is that sometimes it seems like Plato might even be aware of the fact that he's being a little bit too slippery. Um, and that's sort of what's interesting as a form of instruction, that not everything he says is to be taken seriously, but rather it's the process of reading his mistakes that are worthwhile insofar as we learn something from them. Um, and then another way to sort of illustrate this puzzle is to say that a false belief would entail that you're judging that Theaetetus is not Theaetetus. But how could anyone do this? How could you say that thing which I see is not that thing? That would just be kind of a crazy thing to do. Of course, that's not what's really going on. We just don't think it's that thing. It's not that we first identify it's that thing and then say it's not. We say it's not that thing at all. Um, and then he gives another explanation for what knowledge is like, and this is sort of an interesting metaphor to think about. That kind of has a memorable stickiness factor that you could keep with you. He says, and I guess wax is recurring here, and, but he says, knowledge is sort of like a piece of wax which is imprinted upon by the senses. So the mind is a ball of wax of a certain sort, and the senses imprint upon the mind, and that imprinting is our memory. You might think of it as a very literal sort of impression. Um, that could be confusing. I shouldn't say that. Because the impression is the immediate experience, right? And then the idea for Hume would be the wax being imprinted upon. But in any case, um, this sort of account is supposed to be able to explain kind of that, first of all, how we can have false belief, because we can fail to recognize that the seal, like, so take the example of a ring. You imprint a ring in warm wax to give it your seal of authenticity. We can fail to recognize that a seal of a ring, for example, corresponds to the impression made in the wax, and that sort of failure to recognize this correspondence explains what a false belief is. It also is kind of fun in that it explains why people have different propensities. So you might think that a hard-headed person has just really dense wax, and so they don't absorb much. And there's kind of gullible people that absorb everything too quickly, and then their minds are all muddled with a whole series of impressions that are inconsistent or something like that. But at the end of the day, it seems like this kind of colorful metaphor doesn't explain a whole lot more. It just kind of puts the problem back one step, insofar as we don't have a good account of what knowledge is. We just kind of have an interesting story to kind of imagine it, but we still have to explain what is actually going on when the senses imprint on the mind or something like that. The metaphor won't do that work for us. We still need to give a more robust account. So a second account that's offered is that of the aviary, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because we're going long, and because it has a lot of the similar defects as the wax sort of case. So in this case, the mind is like an aviary, which is, I guess, a bird living facility. And here's one at the Denver Zoo. So I guess you have a bunch of different types of birds in this aviary, and those are types of knowledge. And so while you don't have an immediate grasp of any of them at any given moment, they're within your power to retrieve. And so that's kind of how knowledge is. And maybe you have different faculties, you've trained your faculties to a different extent, so you can more readily retrieve the birds or not. So maybe if you're really rusty at math, you have those birds somewhere deep in your aviary, but you can't just readily go pull them out because they're not well trained, they haven't been in use. So another colorful metaphor that has some use, but ultimately we're still going to have to explain. But so what is the analogy is between a bird and a piece of knowledge, but this still doesn't explain what a piece of knowledge is. It just kind of puts it in um, illustrative terms, kind of for fun. So with regard to the true opinion issue that these two metaphors are couched in, Socrates kind of rebuts this idea with the following passage. He says, "When, therefore, judges are justly persuaded about matters which you can know only by seeing them, and not in any other way, and when thus judging of them from report they attain a true opinion about them, they judge without knowledge, and yet are rightly persuaded if they have judged well." So the idea here is that it seems possible to have true opinion without knowledge. So there are cases in which, take a jury or a judge, they are persuaded that um, someone stabbed someone else to death or something like that, and pretty much the only way you could know that, we think, is if you had some sort of direct experience of the event, if you saw it happen in the moment, or if you arrived immediately after and you have some good, in a good Humean fashion, right? If you have some sort of sense impression by which you can refer to in order to say yes, this event occurred. But in the case of a jury or judge, we lack any of that sort of immediate experience. We can only rely on the testimony of others. So it doesn't seem like we can genuinely claim we know, but we can still believe it, and we can still be correct in our belief. It might still be the case that someone killed someone else, even if we can't legitimately say that we personally know it. We just happen to believe it for other sorts of reasons. Um, so true opinion doesn't seem to be enough. You might also think in the case of someone might come to the right answer and they might totally believe it, but then you ask them, well, why? How did you get that answer? And um, they have no explanation. So on a multiple choice quiz, for example, or a true false, there's a 50% chance you'll just get it right by luck. So in that sort of context, you might have a true opinion, you might have picked the right answer, and you believe it to be correct, but if you can't make any account for why it's right, it doesn't seem like you know that it's right. It just seems like it was a matter of luck, sort of. So there seems to be something more to the picture that's necessary in order for it to be genuine knowledge. Yeah. So yeah. So he says true knowledge with an account is the third sort of way to think about this, but we're going to change it to true belief because that is a less question begging way to formulate the account. So because of the problems I just identified, that you might not have a sort of direct experience or any sort of explanation of the event, it seems like in addition you need to have an account or an explanation of what makes this a case of knowledge. So true belief with an account is the third account of knowledge, but there are various different ways you can interpret this idea of account or explanation. So Socrates investigates those quickly. So the first one is that you can define the elements of something in terms of its parts. Um, So breaking down the parts of any sort of thing. So what does it mean to know what a cart is? To know what a cart is to know that it's a certain, it has a certain function, but that it also is a series of planks interconnected that can carry a load, and it has wheels or something like that. But it seems like there's going to be a sort of infinite regress problem here that we're going to need to also have an account for. So what is a wheel? What are planks? How many planks? And break it down so far that it becomes difficult to answer. So this account might not be as good as we would like. And then Mariology is part whole relationships, and this is another little interesting thing that Plato touches on, but I won't cover it, so don't worry about it. We'll just, if you're interested, ask me. So um, here is the same sort of thing laid out again. I did it in the order that Plato did it, which maybe was a mistake because it's out of order now. But there are three accounts of explanation, and just so we're clear, right? Account, these words are supposed to be interchangeable. Jiminy crickets. So on the one hand, there's the conscious awareness or reasons for belief. So this idea seems pretty intuitive, I think. You might think that that's kind of why there's, on those multiple choice questions, sometimes professors will ask you to provide a rationale for your answer because it constitutes knowledge if you can provide an explanation for why you hold something to be true. So Right. So that seems to get us some way towards making sense of knowledge. It seems like you have a better sense of knowing something if you can explain why. But I think this is too strong of a condition. So I think this little picture of the frog will be useful in more than one place. Um, so here it's going to be useful insofar as, sorry, I'm distracted. Conscious awareness of reasons for belief. So it seems like, take this case of a frog, like when you saw this picture, you could immediately identify it as such. You didn't need to give any sort of explanation or reasons for that belief. Of course, you might be able to, but you might not be able to give any sort of sufficient characterization or a really good, robust account of why it's a frog, or maybe consider the difference between a frog and a toad. How are you going to account for this? You might not have the conscious resources or reasons for belief in order to make this distinction. But it nonetheless seems like you know what the difference is. You're able to effectively act in such a way as to account for each when it's appropriate. So maybe conscious awareness of reasons for a belief is too high of a standard, and we should consider something else. So we've already accounted for the recounting of elements one, and this is just the cart case, so I won't cover that too long. But it seems like we don't know all of the elements of a thing, and we don't need to in order to understand it. Especially when we get into more sophisticated objects, I can identify a computer without being able to tell you many of the technical details of what a computer is. So that just doesn't seem to work well. And then finally, distinguishing characteristic. This is the third account that he considers, and so the idea here is that, like, what you have knowledge of a thing if you know what is a unique feature of that thing. But again, I think we can use the frog. You might not know precisely what single feature is definitive of frogs, all frogs, and only frogs. And interestingly, in a field like biology, there might not be any such single characteristic that all and only any given class of organisms have. So you might be able to say, well, they require water or something like that, or specific ways they breed, or all sorts of different features, but those sorts of considerations are going to apply to amphibians more broadly. Or you might say something very specific about the way they move or something like that, or what they eat, but then you're probably going to end up missing out on certain sorts of strange frogs. There's frogs that only swim and they don't ever hop, or they only ever eat certain very specific organisms, or they don't have a normal jaw structure. So the distinguishing characteristic account kind of presupposes that there is a unique characteristic for every entity out there. And for some things, there might not be anything that is totally unique to all and only those things. So, in good Socratic fashion, Plato ends in a sort of state of puzzlement with no clear resolution, but at least he's eliminated some of the things that don't work. So that was a long one, but this is a long reading. So thank you for your time, and I'll see you next time.